Welcome to Sleepless Survivors. Tonight, we invite you to drift into slumber as we explore the shadowed corridors and hidden truths of medieval castle life. Close your eyes, settle into comfort, and let these ancient stories carry you gently towards sleep. When we think of castles today, our minds often conjure images of fairy tales and romance. We picture grand balls, noble knights, and beautiful princesses in flowing gowns. But the reality of castle life was far different from these enchanted fantasies. Tonight, as you relax and prepare for sleep, we'll journey back through the centuries to discover what life was truly like within those massive stone walls. The castles that still dot the European landscape stand as monuments to a time when survival meant surrounding yourself with stone barriers several feet thick. These weren't palaces built for comfort or beauty. They were fortresses, designed first and foremost for defence, and the people who lived within them endured conditions that would shock our modern sensibilities. Let's begin our journey at the very foundation of castle life, with the cold, unforgiving stone that formed the walls of these medieval strongholds. Imagine waking each morning in a castle chamber. The first thing you would notice, even before opening your eyes, would be the cold. The penetrating, bone-deep cold that no amount of tapestries or animal furs could fully banish. Castle walls were built thick for protection, sometimes measuring 15 or even 20 feet across at the base. But this very thickness that kept enemies out also trapped the cold inside. Stone absorbs cold and holds it, releasing it slowly into the interior spaces. Even in summer, the inner chambers of a castle remained cool. In winter, they became nearly unbearable. The fireplaces that we see in castle ruins today seem impressively large, and indeed they were. But despite their size, they did little to heat the vast stone chambers. Heat rises, and in rooms with ceilings 20 or 30 feet high, the warmth from a fire would ascend into the upper reaches of the chamber, leaving the lower portions frigid. Those lucky enough to sit directly beside the fire might feel some warmth on one side of their body, while the other side remained cold. The nobility who occupied the primary chambers had the luxury of fireplaces. The servants and lower-ranking inhabitants often had no heat source at all in their sleeping quarters. They would pile together for warmth, sometimes sharing beds with 3 or 4 others, bodies pressed close under piles of rough woolen blankets and animal skins. Windows in castles were few and small, designed more for defence than for light or ventilation. Archers needed narrow slits to shoot through while remaining protected, not large openings that would expose them to enemy fire. This meant that castle interiors were perpetually dim, lit only by the weak daylight that filtered through these tiny openings and by candles and torches at night. The lack of natural light had profound effects on the inhabitants. Seasonal depression, though not understood at the time, must have been common. People rose in darkness and often worked through the day in spaces where they could barely see their hands in front of their faces without artificial light. The constant dimness strained eyes and created a sombre, oppressive atmosphere. Glass windows were an extraordinary luxury in medieval times. Only the wealthiest castle owners could afford them, and even then the glass was thick, uneven, and let in little light. Most windows were simply open spaces, sometimes covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or thin sheets of horn to keep out the worst of the wind and rain. But these coverings also blocked light, so inhabitants had to choose between freezing or living in darkness. The wind whistled through castles constantly. Despite the massive walls, cold draughts found their way through gaps in shutters, under doors, through the very mortar between stones. Tapestries hung on walls served a practical purpose beyond decoration. They provided a layer of insulation, a barrier between the cold stone and the living space. The wealthy covered their walls with elaborate woven scenes. The less wealthy made do with simpler cloth hangings or nothing at all. As you drift deeper towards sleep, imagine the sounds of castle life. The constant drip of water echoing through stone passages, the whistle of wind through arrow slits, the crackle of fires, the shuffle of feet on stone floors, the murmur of voices echoing in vaulted halls. Castles were never silent, even in the deepest night. Let's consider the sanitation conditions within castle walls. This is perhaps one of the darkest realities of medieval castle life, and one that contradicts our romantic notions most starkly. The smell alone would have been overwhelming to our modern senses. Toilets in castles were called garde-robes, a French term that literally means guard the robes. because the ammonia from human waste was thought to repel moths and protect clothing stored nearby. Guardrobes were essentially stone seats built into the thickness of the outer walls, with a shaft that dropped down to dispose of waste. Sometimes these shafts emptied into the moat. Sometimes they dropped into pits at the base of the castle walls. Sometimes they simply released onto the exterior wall face, where waste would streak down the stone. The smell from these garderobes permeated nearby chambers. The stone passages leading to them reeked constantly. In some castles, particularly smaller or older ones, garderobes were shared by many people, with no privacy beyond perhaps a simple curtain. The seats themselves were often built side by side so multiple people would relieve themselves simultaneously, in full view of one another. In the coldest months of winter, the journey to the garderobe could be treacherous. Imagine making your way through dark, freezing passages in the middle of the night, perhaps by the light of a single candle, to sit on a stone seat in a draughty shaft where wind howled up from below. Many people avoided this journey by using chamber pots in their rooms, which servants would then have to empty, carrying the foul contents through the castle to dispose of them. The great halls where nobles dined and conducted business often had rushes or straw scattered on the stone floors. These rushes would absorb spills and provide a bit of cushioning underfoot, but they also absorbed everything else: spilled food, spilled drink, vomit from drunk revellers, grease from the walls where people wiped their hands, and worse. Dogs lived in the halls, eating scraps and leaving their own waste. The rushes might be changed only a few times a year. The smell and the vermin they harboured were simply accepted as normal. Thomas Becket, before he became Archbishop of Canterbury, served as Lord Chancellor to Henry II of England. When he travelled, witnesses reported that servants would go ahead to change the rushes in whatever castle or manor he was to stay in, because he refused to walk on rushes that hadn't been freshly laid. This was considered an extraordinary and even pretentious demand. Bathing was infrequent. The effort required to heat enough water to fill even a small tub was considerable. Wood or peat had to be gathered or purchased, fires built and maintained for hours to heat water, the water carried in buckets from wells or cisterns. For nobles, large wooden tubs might be brought to their chambers and filled bucket by bucket with heated water. They would bathe perhaps once a month, or for special occasions. The same bath water might be used by multiple family members in succession, with the lord bathing first, then his lady, then other family members in order of rank. Servants and common folk bathed far less frequently. Some might go months without a proper bath, instead wiping themselves down with cloths. Medieval people were not unaware that bathing could be pleasant and healthful, but the practical difficulties made it a rare luxury for most. They used herbs and perfumes to mask body odour instead. The wealthy would carry small pouches of dried flowers or aromatic herbs to hold up to their noses in particularly offensive situations. The combination of infrequent bathing, primitive sanitation, chamber pots, garderobes, unchanged rushes, and the presence of animals meant that medieval castles smelled in ways that would be intolerable to us today. The human nose adapts to constant smells, so those who lived in castles daily would have been less aware of the stench than a visitor might be. But even accounting for adaptation, the smell would have been a constant presence, particularly in summer when the heat intensified every odour. As you relax further into sleep, let's consider the food that sustained castle inhabitants. The diet varied enormously depending on one's rank, but even for nobles, it was far removed from the elaborate medieval feasts we see depicted in films. The castle kitchen was typically located in a separate building, or in a ground floor area far from the living quarters because of the fire risk. This meant that food had to be carried through cold passages to reach the Great Hall, losing heat along the way. A meal that was hot when it left the kitchen might be lukewarm or cold by the time it reached the Lord's table. Preservation of food was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, meat had to be preserved by salting, smoking, or drying. Fresh meat was available when animals were slaughtered, but preserved meat formed the bulk of the diet for much of the year. Salt beef, salt pork, smoked fish, dried cod. These items were tough, intensely salty, and needed to be soaked before cooking to remove some of the salt. Spices were prized not primarily for their exotic flavours, as we might think, but because they could mask the taste of meat that was beginning to turn. Even with preservation efforts, meat often developed an off taste. Strong flavours like pepper, cinnamon, cloves and ginger could cover this. Only the wealthy could afford imported spices, so their use was a display of status as much as a culinary choice. Bread was the staple of every meal, but its quality varied. The nobility ate white bread made from finely milled wheat flour. Lower ranks ate bread made from barley, rye or mixed grains, which was coarse, dark and dense. The very poorest ate bread that included ground peas or beans mixed with the grain, creating a heavy, barely palatable loaf that nonetheless filled the stomach. Trenchers were thick slices of old bread used as plates. Food would be placed on these bread trenchers, and the bread would soak up the juices and sauces. At the end of the meal, the trenchers, now soaked with gravy and grease, would be eaten or given to the poor. This practice meant that the servants and beggars who depended on castle charity were eating bread that had served as a plate, absorbing whatever had been placed on it. Fresh vegetables and fruits were scarce, particularly in winter. Root vegetables like turnips and onions stored reasonably well. Cabbage could be preserved as sauerkraut. Dried peas and beans provided protein, but green vegetables and fresh fruits were seasonal luxuries. This diet, heavy in salt and meat, light in fresh produce, led to various deficiency diseases. Scurvy was common among those who went months without fresh food. Milk and fresh dairy products spoiled quickly. Cheese and butter could be preserved with salt, but fresh milk was a rarity for most, consumed quickly when available. Much of the milk produced was turned into cheese immediately, so it could be stored. The water supply was always a concern. Wells had to be dug deep enough to reach clean water, but were often contaminated by the waste pits of the guardrobes or by animal refuse. Water from cisterns that collected rainwater was safer, but could run low. During dry periods, many people preferred to drink weak beer or ale instead of water, not because they were constantly drunk, but because the brewing process made the liquid safer to consume. The alcohol content was low, just enough to kill bacteria, but not enough to cause intoxication from normal consumption. Food poisoning was common. Without understanding of bacteria or proper food safety, people regularly consumed food that was contaminated. Stomach ailments were simply a normal part of life. Chronic digestive problems plagued almost everyone. The meals themselves followed rigid social hierarchies. The lord and his family sat at the high table on a raised platform at one end of the great hall. This position allowed them to look down upon the rest of the hall, reinforcing their superior status. The most favoured guests and high-ranking household members sat with them, or at tables nearby. Further down the hall, lesser members of the household sat in order of decreasing rank. Servants would process through the hall carrying dishes, which would be presented first to the high table. The lord would be served the choicest portions. Lower-ranking diners received less choice cuts, and by the time dishes reached the lower tables they might be cold and picked over. Those at the lowest tables often went hungry if food ran short. Meals were communal and noisy. People ate with their hands and with knives, as forks were not yet in common use. Spoons existed for soups and porridge. Diners would cut meat with their personal knives and eat it with their fingers. Bones were thrown to the dogs that roamed the hall. People wiped their hands on their clothing or on the tablecloth. Belching and other sounds of eating were not considered particularly rude. Entertainment during meals might include musicians, jesters or storytellers, but it might also include rougher amusements. Dwarfs or people with physical deformities were sometimes kept as curiosities, displayed and mocked for the amusement of the nobles. This casual cruelty was woven into the fabric of medieval life. As sleep draws nearer, let us explore the darkness of disease and medical care within castle walls. The medieval period was a time of devastating illnesses, and castles offered little protection from the plagues and pestilences that swept through Europe. The Black Death, which peaked in Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population. Castle walls could not keep out the disease. Rats harbouring infected fleas moved freely through castles, living in the walls, nesting in the stored grain, scurrying through the halls at night. When the plague came to a region, it came to the castles as well as the villages. The symptoms were horrific. Buboes, swollen lymph nodes, would appear in the groin, armpits or neck, growing to the size of apples and turning black. Fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea and terrible pain afflicted victims. Many died, within days of showing first symptoms. Others lingered in agony for weeks. The smell of the sick and dying filled the castle chambers. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacteria or viruses. Doctors, trained in the theories of the ancient Greeks, believed disease was caused by imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments aimed to rebalance these humours through bloodletting, purging, and the application of various poultices and potions. These treatments were at best useless and often actively harmful, weakening already sick patients. Bloodletting was considered a cure for almost any ailment. A physician would open a vein with a lancet and allow blood to flow out into a bowl. The theory held that removing excess blood would restore balance to the humours. In reality, it weakened patients, making them less able to fight infection. Leeches were also used to remove blood, applied to the skin where they would attach and feed. Other common treatments included inducing vomiting or diarrhea to purge bad humours from the body. Poisonous substances like mercury and arsenic were administered in small doses. Poultices made from animal dung, crushed insects, or bizarre mixtures of herbs were applied to wounds and sores. Holy relics were brought to bedsides, and prayers were offered constantly. Surgery was crude and agonizing. There was no anesthesia beyond perhaps getting the patient drunk on wine or spirits. No understanding of sterilization or infection. Surgeons would use the same unwashed instruments on patient after patient. They would probe wounds with their fingers, spreading infection. Amputations were performed with saws, the stumps cauterized with hot irons to stop bleeding. The screams of surgical patients echoed through castle halls. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Many women died in labour or shortly after from infection or hemorrhage. Infant mortality was staggering. As many as 1 in 3 children died before their first birthday. Half of all children died before reaching adulthood. It was common for women to bear 8 or 10 children, knowing that only a few would survive to adulthood. Midwives attended births, but their knowledge was limited. If labour went wrong, if the baby was breech or the mother hemorrhaged badly, there was little that could be done. Prayers and appeals to St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, were the main recourse. Women went into labour knowing they might not survive. Many made their confessions and put their affairs in order before their lying in period, preparing for death. Other diseases plagued medieval people constantly. Smallpox left survivors scarred and sometimes blind. Leprosy was greatly feared, and those who contracted it were often expelled from castles and communities, forced to live in isolation. Tuberculosis wasted victims slowly, causing them to cough blood and waste away over months or years. Dysentery, typhoid, and other intestinal diseases swept through populations regularly. Dental health was poor. Without modern dental care, teeth would decay, causing abscesses and terrible pain. The only treatment was extraction, performed without anaesthesia by a barber or blacksmith using forceps. Many people lost most of their teeth by middle age, making it difficult to chew the tough meat that formed a large part of the diet. Skin conditions were ubiquitous. Without regular bathing and with limited changes of clothing, people suffered from rashes, boils, and infestations of lice and fleas. Everyone had lice. Nobles and peasants alike scratched constantly. Lice lived in clothing and hair, biting and spreading disease. Fleas were equally common, living in the rushes on floors and in bedding. The flea bites were not just irritating, fleas spread plague and typhus. Mental illness was not understood. Those suffering from what we would now recognise as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or other conditions were thought to be possessed by demons or cursed by God. Treatment might involve exorcism, prayer, or confinement. Some were kept locked in castle cellars or towers for years. Others were simply expelled from the castle to wander as beggars. Pain was a constant companion in medieval life. Chronic conditions like arthritis, back problems, and old injuries caused daily suffering. There were few effective painkillers. Alcohol and opium-based preparations could dull pain somewhat, but these were not always available. Most people simply endured, praying for relief. The injured and sick were often cared for in the castle chapel, or in chambers near it, so they could hear Mass and receive the sacraments. The smell of sickness, of festering wounds and bodily waste, mixed with the smell of incense. The groans of the suffering provided a constant background to prayers and devotions. Let your mind drift now to the violence that was intrinsic to castle life. Castles were built for war, and war was never far away. Even in times of nominal peace, violence simmered just beneath the surface of daily life. The castle garrison consisted of soldiers whose primary purpose was to defend the fortress and to serve their lord in his military ventures. These were rough men, trained in the use of weapons, accustomed to violence. Fights among soldiers were common, breaking out over gambling debts, insults, or simply boredom and too much drink. These fights could be brutal, resulting in serious injury or death. The lord of the castle had the power of high justice, meaning he could pass sentence of death on criminals. Executions were carried out in or near the castle, often in a public area so that both household members and local villagers could witness. Hangings were common. The condemned would be led to a gallows, the noose placed around their neck, and then they would be pushed off a ladder or platform to strangle slowly. Death by hanging was not instantaneous. Victims would kick and struggle, their faces turning purple until they finally died of asphyxiation, a process that could take many minutes. Beheading was considered a more merciful form of execution, generally reserved for nobles. The condemned would kneel and place their head on a block. The executioner, using a sword or an axe, would attempt to sever the head with a single blow. But executioners were not always skilled, and sometimes multiple blows were required, turning the execution into a butchery as the victim screamed and bled. Other forms of execution were even more gruesome. Burning at the stake was used for heretics and witches. The victim would be tied to a post with wood piled around them. The fire would be lit and they would burn alive, screaming in agony until death or unconsciousness came. Sometimes a bag of gunpowder would be tied around the victim's neck as a mercy, to kill them more quickly when the flames reached it. Drawing and quartering was reserved for traitors. The victim would be hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and revived. They would then be disemboweled while still alive, their intestines and organs removed and burned before their eyes. Finally, they would be beheaded and their body cut into 4 parts, which would be displayed in different locations as a warning to others. Torture was an accepted part of the justice system. It was used both to extract confessions and as a punishment in itself. The castle dungeon might contain a variety of instruments designed to inflict pain. The rack stretched victims until their joints dislocated. Thumbscrews crushed fingers and toes. The strappado involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and then hoisting them into the air by these hands, dislocating the shoulders. Suspected criminals might be tortured until they confessed. The fact that people would confess to anything under torture to make it stop was not seen as a problem. A confession, however obtained, was considered valid. Many innocent people confessed to crimes they did not commit, and were then executed based on these forced confessions. The screams of those being tortured could be heard throughout certain areas of the castle. Prisoners awaiting trial or execution were kept in dungeons, often underground chambers that were cold, dark, and damp. They might be chained to the walls, unable to stand or lie down properly. Food was minimal, perhaps bread and water once a day. There were no sanitation facilities. Prisoners lived in their own waste. Disease was rampant in dungeons. Many died before they could be brought to trial. Warfare itself was brutal beyond our modern comprehension. When armies clashed in battle, the fighting was hand-to-hand, visceral and bloody. Knights in armour would hack at each other with swords, axes and maces. The force of a mace blow could crush a skull even through a helmet. Sword cuts could sever limbs. Arrows and crossbow bolts would punch through armour at close range, leaving victims to bleed out slowly on the battlefield. The wounded after battle faced terrible fates. With no effective treatment for major wounds, amputation was often the only option, and even then infection would likely set in. Many wounded soldiers were simply left on the battlefield to die. The battlefield after combat was a scene of horror, with the dead and dying lying where they fell, the cries of the wounded filling the air. Scavengers would come, robbing the dead and sometimes killing the wounded to take their belongings. If a castle came under siege, conditions inside would deteriorate rapidly. The besieging army would cut off supplies. As food ran low, first the best food would be reserved for the lord and fighting men. Servants and non-essential personnel would be put on reduced rations. Horses might be slaughtered for meat. If the siege continued, starvation would set in. People would eat dogs, cats, rats, even leather and bark, trying desperately to survive. Disease thrived in besieged castles. The concentration of people, the reduced sanitation as systems broke down, the weakened state of the inhabitants from hunger, all contributed to outbreaks of illness. Typhus, spread by lice, was particularly common in sieges. The sick would be crowded together, spreading infection to others. The attacking army might use psychological warfare. They might catapult dead animals or even human corpses over the walls, both to spread disease and to demoralize the defenders. The stench of rotting flesh would permeate the castle. They might torture or execute prisoners in view of the castle walls, so that those inside could see the fate that awaited them if they were captured. If a castle fell after a siege, the conquering army might be given permission to sack it. Soldiers would pour through the gates, killing male defenders, looting valuables, and assaulting women. This was considered a normal part of warfare, a reward for the soldiers and a punishment for those who had resisted. The level of brutality could be extreme, with entire populations of castles massacred. Women in castles faced particular dangers. Rape was common, not just in wartime but in peacetime as well. A woman of low status had little recourse if she was assaulted by a man of higher rank. The concept of consent as we understand it barely existed. A lord could force himself on a servant or peasant woman with little fear of consequences. Even women of noble birth could be vulnerable, especially if they were widows or if their male relatives were weak or absent. Child mortality meant that most women went through the trauma of losing children. But beyond this, children who survived faced their own hardships. Childhood, as we understand it, a protected time of play and learning, did not exist for most medieval children. By age 7 or 8, children of common birth were expected to work. Boys might be sent away to learn a trade or to serve as pages in other households. Girls would help with household tasks, spinning, weaving, cooking, and cleaning from a young age. Discipline of children was harsh. Beating was considered not just acceptable but necessary. The saying, "spare the rod and spoil the child," reflected common beliefs. Children were beaten for disobedience, for failure to learn lessons, or sometimes simply because the adult was in a foul mood. The beatings could be severe, leaving bruises and welts. Permanent injury or even death from beatings was not unknown. Noble children fared somewhat better in terms of physical comfort, but they too faced hardships. Boys destined for knighthood would begin training at a young age. This training was physically demanding and often brutal. They would practice with weapons for hours, building strength and skill. Mock combats could result in real injuries. The culture emphasized toughness, and showing weakness or fear would result in mockery and punishment. As you sink deeper into sleep, imagine the long, dark nights in a medieval castle. The hours after sunset and before dawn were times when the castle became a different place, full of shadows and strange sounds. Artificial lighting was expensive and dim. Candles were made from beeswax, a costly material, or from tallow, rendered animal fat that burned with a smoky, foul-smelling flame. Torches could provide more light, but had to be tended constantly and created smoke that stung the eyes and lungs. Fires in fireplaces provided light as well as heat, but their flickering flames cast dancing shadows that could make still objects seem to move. Most people went to bed soon after dark, as there was little point in staying awake in the cold and darkness. They would sleep for several hours, then wake in the middle of the night. This period of wakefulness in the night's midst was called the watch, and it was used for prayer, for thinking, for conversation, or for intimacy between married couples. After an hour or two they would sleep again until dawn. Sleeping arrangements varied by status. The lord and lady might have a private chamber, though even they might share it with servants who slept on pallets on the floor, ready to attend to any needs. Others would sleep in common rooms, multiple people to a bed, or on benches or floors. Privacy was rare. People would sleep in their underclothes or sometimes naked, piled together under blankets and furs. The sounds of the night included snoring, coughing, the rustle of straw mattresses, the scratch of rats in the walls, the distant howl of wolves outside the castle. The sick moaned in their sleep. Babies cried. People relieved themselves in chamber pots. All of this in close quarters, with thin cloth hangings providing the only barriers between sleeping areas. Nightmares were common, and were thought to be sent by demons or to be prophetic visions. People would wake in terror, believing they had been visited by evil spirits. There was no electric light to switch on, no immediate way to banish the darkness and reassure oneself that it was only a dream. The darkness pressed in, and shadows seemed alive with threat. The watch of the night was also when thieves and assassins might strike. Castles had watchmen who would patrol the walls and keep an eye out for threats, but inside the castle itself the dark hours could be dangerous. A knife in the darkness could end a life, settling a grudge or removing a rival. Political intrigue and murder went hand in hand in medieval court life. Castle staff who had to move through the passages at night carried candles or small oil lamps. But these provided only a tiny circle of light. Beyond that circle, the darkness was absolute. The passages twisted and turned. Strange sounds echoed from unseen sources. It was easy to become disoriented, to imagine footsteps following you, to feel eyes watching from the shadows. Superstition was deeply embedded in medieval life. People believed in ghosts, demons, and malevolent spirits. They believed that the dead could walk, that witches could cast curses, that the devil himself might appear. Every unexplained sound, every misfortune might be attributed to supernatural causes. Protective charms and prayers were constant defences against unseen threats. The castle chapel was a place of sanctuary, but it too had its darkness. Relics of saints, bits of bone or cloth stained with blood, were kept in ornate containers and were believed to have miraculous powers. Some of these relics were genuine, but many were fraudulent, created by unscrupulous individuals to make money. People would pray before these relics, believing they were in the presence of something holy, not knowing they were venerating a pig bone or a scrap of ordinary cloth. The church taught that the world was a vale of tears, a place of suffering that had to be endured to earn heavenly reward. This life was meant to be hard. Suffering was seen as a test of faith, or as punishment for sin. Pleasure and comfort were viewed with suspicion, as potentially sinful distractions from spiritual matters. This worldview meant that little effort was made to improve living conditions. Suffering was expected, even valorized. Heresy was a serious crime, punishable by death. Anyone who questioned church teachings, who interpreted scripture differently from accepted doctrine, or who followed any other religion, risked being accused of heresy. The Inquisition, established to root out heresy, used torture to extract confessions. Once convicted, heretics were handed over to secular authorities for execution, usually by burning. The fear of being accused of heresy was pervasive. People were careful about what they said, even in private, knowing that a denunciation could lead to torture and death. Jewish communities faced particular persecution. They were blamed for everything from disease to crop failures. Pogroms, organised massacres of Jewish people, occurred periodically. During the Black Death, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and causing the plague. Thousands were murdered. Those who survived lived in constant fear, segregated in ghettos, restricted in what occupations they could pursue, marked out as different and dangerous. Women accused of witchcraft faced horrific ordeals. The accusation alone was often enough to destroy a life. The accused would be subjected to trials by ordeal, tests designed to prove guilt or innocence through divine intervention. One common ordeal was trial by water. The accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, it proved they were a witch, and they would be pulled out and executed. If they sank, they were innocent, though they might well drown before they could be pulled out. Either way, the accused woman faced death. Torture was used routinely in witch trials. Devices like the breast ripper, which tore off a woman's breasts, or the iron spider, which ripped flesh from the body, were employed. Victims were kept awake for days, interrogated constantly until they were so exhausted and pain-racked that they would confess to anything. Many confessed to impossible acts, to flying on broomsticks or consorting with the devil, just to make the torture stop. The power structures within castles were rigid and absolute. The Lord's word was law. He could order beatings, imprisonment, or death for those under his authority. His mood could dictate the atmosphere of the entire castle. A cruel or unstable lord could make life miserable for everyone. Servants and lower-ranking household members lived in constant awareness of the lord's moods, trying to anticipate and please him to avoid punishment. Favoritism and intrigue were constant. Those who gained the lord's favour received better treatment, more food, warmer quarters, gifts. Those who fell out of favour might be cast out entirely, left to fend for themselves with no resources. People jockeyed for position, spread rumours about rivals, formed alliances and betrayed them. The atmosphere could be poisonous with suspicion and resentment. Sexual politics added another layer of darkness. Lords took mistresses from among the household. These women might gain power and privilege from the relationship, but they were also vulnerable. A mistress could be discarded at any time, cast out pregnant and disgraced. The wife of the lord might resent mistresses and make their lives difficult, or she might be powerless to do anything about them. Children born of these liaisons were bastards, with no legal rights, and often facing discrimination throughout their lives. Arranged marriages were the norm for nobility. Marriage was a political and economic arrangement, not a love match. Brides and grooms often met for the first time at their wedding. Girls might be married as young as 12 or 13 to much older men. The wedding night was a public affair in some cases, with witnesses present to confirm the marriage was consummated. The pressure on young brides was immense, and the experience often traumatic. Widows faced uncertainty. A noblewoman might have some protection if she was wealthy in her own right or if her family was powerful, but many widows were left vulnerable, their property passing to their late husband's male heirs. Widows might be pressured to remarry quickly, or they might be shunted aside, their children taken from them to be raised by others. The elderly were not revered as they are in some cultures. If they could no longer work or serve a useful function, they might be seen as burdens. There was no social safety net. Old servants who could no longer perform their duties might be turned out with nothing. Some aged nobles retired to monasteries or convents, essentially entering a form of religious retirement. Others lingered on in castles, increasingly infirm, dependent on the grudging charity of their relatives. Physical disabilities were viewed through the lens of medieval understanding, which often attributed them to sin or demonic influence. Those born with disabilities might be seen as cursed or as divine punishment for their parents' sins. Little accommodation was made for disabled individuals. A knight who lost a leg in battle might be pensioned off if he had served well, but he would never regain his former status. A commoner who became disabled would likely end up begging. Mental disabilities and illnesses carried a terrible stigma. Those who today we would recognise as having developmental disabilities were called idiots or simpletons, and were often mocked or mistreated. Some were kept locked away, others were abandoned or turned out to wander. The concept of treating such individuals with dignity and compassion was largely absent. The castle's economy was based on extraction. The lord's wealth came from the labour of peasants who worked the surrounding lands. These peasants owed a portion of their harvest to the lord, as well as various fees and services. They were tied to the land, not free to leave without permission. Serfs, as they were called, were not quite slaves, but they were not free either. Their lives were circumscribed, their opportunities limited. They worked hard, faced the same diseases and hardships as everyone else, and had little hope of improving their lot. The castle took from the peasants, but gave back little. Protection from bandits and enemy armies was the supposed justification for the arrangement, but the level of actual protection varied. Some lords took their responsibilities seriously, others simply extracted wealth and provided minimal security in return. When armies passed through an area, peasant fields were often trampled and crops seized, leaving the peasants to starve. Famine was a recurring nightmare. A bad harvest, caused by poor weather or disease in crops, could lead to widespread starvation. Grain stores might be kept by the lord, but these were for the use of the castle household first. Peasants would starve while the castle granary remained full. During famines, people ate anything they could find: grass, tree bark, even clay. Babies were abandoned because there was no food to feed them. The old and weak died first, but in severe famines, whole communities could be devastated. When famine struck, it brought disease with it. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Typhus and other diseases spread rapidly through weakened populations. The social order could break down. Desperate people turned to banditry, attacking travellers or even raiding other villages. Parents might abandon children they could not feed or even commit infanticide. These were not rare, exceptional events, but recurring features of medieval life. Warfare and famine often went together. Armies would deliberately destroy crops to starve out enemies, a tactic called scorched earth. They would burn fields, slaughter livestock, and poison wells. The suffering this caused to civilian populations was immense, but it was considered a legitimate military strategy. The peasants caught in the middle had no say in the wars and alliances of their betters, but they bore the brunt of the suffering. The castle represented power and control, but it was also a prison of sorts. Those who lived within its walls were trapped by social hierarchies, by the brutal realities of medieval life, by the constant proximity of violence, disease, and death. Even the lord himself was not truly free. He was bound by obligations to his own overlord, by the need to maintain his military strength, by the demands of managing his lands and household. The weight of power was its own burden. Let us consider the spiritual life of the castle, which was meant to provide meaning and hope amidst the hardship. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval life. The church bell marked the hours. Prayers were said before meals and at bedtime. The castle chapel held regular services, but the medieval understanding of Christianity was very different from modern practice. The focus was heavily on sin, judgment, and punishment. Hell was depicted in vivid, terrifying detail in church art and sermons. Demons tormented the damned in fires that burned but never consumed. Sinners were subjected to punishments tailored to their specific sins, tortures that would last for eternity. This vision of hell was meant to frighten people into obedience, and it succeeded. The fear of damnation was very real. Purgatory offered some hope. This was an intermediate state where souls could be purified of their sins through suffering before being admitted to heaven. The living could help souls in purgatory through prayers and masses. This led to a system where the wealthy would endow chapels and pay priests to say masses for their souls after death, hoping to reduce their time of purging. The poor had no such recourse and had to hope for the mercy of God. Confession of sins was required, and priests had enormous power through the confessional. They knew the secrets of their parishioners, knew who had committed what sins. This knowledge gave them leverage. A priest could refuse absolution, leaving the sinner unforgiven and facing damnation. Priests were supposed to keep confession secret, but this rule was not always followed, and the threat of exposure could be used to control people. Excommunication was a terrible punishment. To be excommunicated was to be cut off from the church, denied the sacraments, and marked as damned. Other Christians were supposed to shun the excommunicated person. In a society where the church was central to all social life, excommunication was a form of social death. It was used as a weapon by the church against those who defied its authority. Religious relics were big business. Monasteries and churches claimed to possess relics of saints, and these drew pilgrims who would leave donations. Some of these relics were legitimate, though even then their supposed powers were superstitious nonsense. Many were outright frauds. Multiple churches claimed to possess the head of John the Baptist or pieces of the true cross. If all the pieces of the true cross that were claimed to exist had been gathered together, they would have formed not one cross but an entire forest. But people believed, and they paid for the privilege of venerating these relics. Pilgrimages were undertaken by those seeking healing, forgiveness, or spiritual merit. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to visit holy sites. The journey was dangerous. Pilgrims faced bandits, disease, and the rigours of travel. Many died on pilgrimage. But those who survived and reached their destination believed they had gained spiritual benefit. Indulgences represented one of the Church's most controversial practices. An indulgence was supposed to reduce the time a soul would spend in purgatory. They could be purchased with money. The Church used the funds raised from indulgences to finance various projects, including the building of grand cathedrals. The selling of indulgences was essentially the selling of salvation, and it led to widespread corruption. Wealthy sinners could buy forgiveness while the poor suffered. Monasteries and convents were supposed to be places of spiritual devotion, removed from the corruption of the world. In reality, they varied widely. Some were indeed places of genuine piety and learning. Others were refuges for the younger sons and daughters of nobility, places where those who would not inherit could be sent to live out their lives. These individuals might have little religious vocation. Some monasteries became wealthy and corrupt, their abbots living in luxury while the monks worked the fields. Flagellants were groups who believed they could atone for sin through self-punishment. They would parade through towns and countryside, whipping themselves until blood flowed, crying out for mercy and forgiveness. During times of plague or disaster, flagellant movements would swell with members, as people desperately sought to appease God's wrath. The spectacle of these bleeding, chanting processions added to the atmosphere of fear and desperation. Crusades were holy wars proclaimed by the Pope, most famously the Crusades to the Holy Land to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control. Crusaders believed they would earn spiritual merit and forgiveness of sins by fighting. The reality of the Crusades was mass slaughter. Not only were Muslim armies fought, but Jewish communities in Europe were massacred by Crusaders on their way east. When Jerusalem was captured in the First Crusade, the Christian army slaughtered the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, men, women, and children. Blood reportedly ran through the streets ankle deep, and this was done in the name of God, by men who believed they were doing holy work. The military orders, like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were orders of warrior monks, combining religious devotion with military prowess. They became powerful and wealthy, But they were also brutal. Their conflicts with Muslim forces were marked by mutual atrocities. Captured enemies might be enslaved or executed. The Templars in particular became associated with secrecy and rumour, leading eventually to their persecution and destruction. Religion provided some comfort, the promise of a better world after death, but it also reinforced the power structures that kept people in their place. The Church taught that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that kings ruled by the grace of God, that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. This ideology supported the status quo and discouraged rebellion or attempts to improve conditions. Saints were venerated as intercessors, holy men and women who could carry prayers to God. Each saint had particular areas of concern. Saint Anthony was invoked against plague, Saint Apollonia protected against toothache. Saint Sebastian was prayed to during epidemics. People prayed to these saints desperately, hoping for miracles. Sometimes they believed they received them, attributing any positive turn of events to saintly intervention. More often, prayers went unanswered, but this was explained as God's will, mysterious and not to be questioned. Miracles were widely believed in and frequently reported. Statues of Mary were said to weep. Holy springs had healing properties. Saints appeared in visions to chosen individuals. The Church was selective about which miracles it endorsed, investigating claims and approving some while dismissing others. But the culture of miracle belief meant that the boundary between the natural and supernatural was porous. People lived in a world where divine intervention was expected, and signs and wonders were constantly sought. As you drift in the threshold of sleep, consider the limited horizons of medieval life. Most people who lived in and around castles never travelled more than a few miles from where they were born. The world beyond their immediate area was unknown, mysterious, filled with rumour and legend. Maps of the world showed a flat earth with Jerusalem at the centre, surrounded by known lands and then by regions filled with monsters and marvels. It was believed that in distant lands there lived people with heads in their chests, or with feet so large they used them as umbrellas, or who were half human and half beast. These beliefs reflected the profound ignorance of geography that characterized the age. Books were rare and precious. Before the printing press, every book had to be copied by hand, a process that took months or years. Monasteries had scriptoria where monks would copy manuscripts, but these books were often religious texts. Secular literature was less common. The vast majority of people were illiterate and would never read a book in their entire lives. Knowledge was passed down orally or through direct experience. Skills were learned by apprenticeship. Stories and history were preserved in songs and tales told by travelling minstrels and storytellers. This oral culture meant that information could be garbled, that myths and facts blended together, that the past was remembered imperfectly. The pace of change was glacially slow. A person born in a castle in the year 1200 would live their entire life in a world essentially identical to that of their great-grandparents. Technology advanced, but so slowly that most people would not notice changes within their lifetimes. Social structures were rigid. The idea that one could change one's station in life, that society could be organised differently, that progress was possible, these ideas were largely absent. Time itself was experienced differently. Mechanical clocks were invented late in the medieval period and were rare. Most people marked time by the sun, by the seasons, by the church bells that rang out the hours of prayer. The concept of measuring time precisely, of scheduling activities to the minute, did not exist. Life followed natural rhythms, the cycle of day and night, the turn of the seasons. Entertainment was communal and often rough. Feast days might feature performances by jesters, acrobats, or musicians. Mystery plays, religious dramas performed by local guilds, were popular. These plays depicted biblical stories and moral lessons, often with crude humour and spectacle. The audience would participate, calling out comments and reactions. Sports and games provided diversion but were often violent. Bear baiting and bull baiting, where dogs would be set upon a chained bear or bull, were popular spectacles. The animals and dogs would fight, often to the death, while spectators bet on the outcome and cheered. Cockfighting and dogfighting were common. These blood sports were seen as normal entertainment. Hunting was both a necessity and a sport for the nobility. But medieval hunting could be brutal. Deer, boar, and other game animals would be pursued by packs of dogs and hunters on horseback. The terrified animals would be run to exhaustion and then killed. The kill was often prolonged, with hunters stabbing the animal repeatedly with spears. Hunting accidents were common, with hunters gored by boars or thrown from horses. Tournaments were martial contests where knights would compete in jousting and melee combat. While these were supposed to be contests of skill, they were dangerous. Knights were injured and killed in tournaments. The impact of a lance at full charge could shatter bones even through armour. The melee, where groups of knights would fight in mock battle, could descend into chaos with severe injuries. The concept of childhood innocence did not exist. Children witnessed violence, death, and adult sexuality as a matter of course. They attended executions. They saw animals slaughtered. They heard and sometimes saw adults engaged in sexual acts, given the lack of privacy. This was simply how life was, and children were expected to accept it. Alcohol consumption was heavy. Weak beer or ale was consumed throughout the day, even by children, because it was safer than water. But stronger drink was also common. Getting drunk was a frequent pastime. Drunkenness led to fights, accidents, and poor decisions, but it was tolerated as a normal part of life. Gambling was popular despite periodic religious condemnations. Men would gamble on dice games, card games, animal fights, and contests of skill. Fortunes could be won and lost. Gambling debts led to disputes and violence. Some men gambled away everything they had, leaving their families destitute. Prostitution was widespread. Brothels operated openly in towns near castles. Camp followers accompanied armies, providing sexual services to soldiers. Women turned to prostitution out of desperation, having no other means of survival. They faced disease, violence from customers, and social stigma. The church condemned prostitution, but also tacitly accepted it as inevitable, a necessary outlet to prevent worse sins. Sexual violence was endemic. Women without male protection were vulnerable. Armies on the march would assault women in the areas they passed through. Even in peacetime, women travelling alone or working in fields risked attack. Servants in castles could be assaulted by those of higher rank with little recourse. The legal system provided minimal protection, and social attitudes often blamed the victims. As sleep finally takes you completely, let these final dark truths settle into your consciousness. Castle life was not a fairy tale. It was a daily struggle for survival in conditions of cold, darkness, filth, and danger. Pain and death were constant companions. Violence, disease, and suffering were woven into the very fabric of existence. The massive stone walls that we admire today as romantic ruins were built with immense human labour, often by workers who were poorly fed, inadequately housed, and worked to exhaustion. Some died in the construction, crushed by falling stones or fallen from scaffolding. Their deaths were noted, if at all, as simple statistics. The beauty of illuminated manuscripts, the elegance of castle architecture, the poetry and songs that have come down to us, these are the products of a tiny elite. Behind them was a vast population living in darkness, cold, and misery. The cultural achievements of the medieval period were built on a foundation of suffering, and yet people endured. They found moments of joy amidst the hardship. They loved their children, even knowing many would die. They formed friendships. They celebrated feast days with whatever meagre abundance they could muster. They found comfort in faith, even if that faith was rooted in fear. They adapted to conditions that seem unbearable to us, because they had no choice, and because humans are remarkably resilient. The castles that remain today are sanitized versions of their medieval reality. Tourists walk through them, marvelling at the architecture, perhaps attending a medieval fair with people in costume, but the smell is gone. The cold is manageable. The darkness is lit by electric lights. The danger is absent. We cannot truly know what it was like, can only try to imagine from the safety of our modern world. The medieval period was a time of profound darkness, literal and metaphorical. It was a time when life was short, brutal, and painful for most people, when power was absolute and arbitrary, when superstition reigned and knowledge was scarce, when the strong dominated the weak without mercy, when children died, women suffered, and men fought and killed over scraps of land and power. The castles stand as monuments not just to architectural achievement, but to human endurance. The people who lived in them survived conditions we would find intolerable. They faced challenges we cannot imagine. They accepted suffering as the normal state of existence. And through it all, somehow, life continued. Children were born, grew up, had children of their own. The cycle repeated generation after generation in the cold stone halls. These stones have witnessed centuries of human drama. They have absorbed the tears of grieving mothers, the screams of the tortured, the prayers of the desperate, the laughter of feasts, the whispers of lovers. If stones could speak, what tales they would tell. Tales of glory and honour, yes, but also tales of misery, cruelty and despair. The medieval world was not our world. It operated by different rules, different values, different assumptions about what life was and should be. To understand it, we must set aside our modern sensibilities and try to see it as it was. Not romantic or noble, but hard and unforgiving. Not a time to be wished for, but a time to be learned from. The morning in a castle began long before dawn for most inhabitants. In the deepest winter months, when darkness lingered until well past what we would call 8 o'clock, servants and workers were already moving through the freezing passages, beginning their daily labours. There was no sleeping in, no gradual awakening to an alarm clock that could be snoozed. Life operated on a different rhythm, dictated by necessity and enforced by strict social hierarchy. The first to rise were often the kitchen servants, who needed to rekindle fires that had been banked overnight. The castle kitchen required massive fires to cook for the large household. Starting these fires from the embers was a skill, requiring careful placement of kindling and patient blowing to coax flames back to life. If the fire had gone completely out overnight, starting it anew was a laborious process involving flint and steel, striking sparks onto tinder until something caught. Water had to be drawn from the well, a task that fell to the lowest-ranking servants. In winter, the well might be frozen, requiring the ice to be broken before buckets could be lowered. The water was shockingly cold, and drawing it up from depths of 30 or 40 feet was physically demanding work. Multiple trips were needed to fill the containers in the kitchen, and this was just the beginning of the day's water needs. Imagine being a young servant girl, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, assigned to empty the chamber pots each morning. You would go from room to room, collecting the pots filled with the night waste of your betters. The smell would be overwhelming, especially in rooms where sick people had spent the night. You would carry these pots, trying not to spill, down passages and stairs to wherever they were to be emptied. In some castles, this meant a long walk to a midden heap outside. In others, you would empty them into the guardrobes, adding to the filth there. Your hands would be red and chapped from the cold and from constant contact with water and waste. You would have no gloves. Your clothing would be thin and worn, offering little protection. You would be hungry. The servants typically ate only after the nobles had been served, and that would be hours away. But you would do your work, because not doing it would result in a beating, and because there was no alternative. The nobles would rise somewhat later, but their mornings were not much more comfortable. The chamber would be cold despite any fire that might have burned through the night. Frost might coat the inside of the windows. Getting out from under the blankets and furs required genuine courage, a plunge into cold air that would make you gasp. Dressing was a lengthy process for nobles, particularly women. The elaborate layers of clothing that denoted status had to be put on in sequence. A woman would not dress herself but would be attended by servants. First the linen undergarments, a chemise that went against the skin, then layers of gowns, each laced or tied. Sleeves were separate pieces that had to be attached, belts and accessories added. The entire process could take an hour. Men's clothing was somewhat less elaborate but still required assistance. The wealthy wore layers as well, with fitted hose that required help to put on properly, tunics, surcoats, and outer garments. Everything was fastened with laces or buttons, and buttons were expensive, a mark of wealth. The clothing itself was heavy, the fabrics thick wool, or sometimes silk for the very wealthy. Personal hygiene in the morning was minimal by our standards. A basin of water might be provided for washing hands and face. The water would be cold unless servants had heated some, and hot water was not always available. People would splash their faces, perhaps rub their teeth with a cloth, but there was no running water, no bathroom sink with hot and cold taps. Soap existed but was harsh, made from animal fat and lye. It was not pleasant to use and was often reserved for washing clothes rather than bodies. Hair care for women was time-consuming. Long hair was the norm, and it needed to be brushed and arranged. Married women typically covered their hair with veils or wimples, elaborate head coverings that denoted their married status. Getting these arranged properly required help and patience. Unmarried women and girls might wear their hair uncovered or with simpler coverings. Men's grooming included shaving for those who did not wear beards. Shaving was done with a straight razor, a sharp blade that required skill to use without cutting oneself. The razor would be stropped on leather to maintain its edge. Without shaving cream as we know it, the process was uncomfortable and often resulted in nicks and cuts. Many men chose to wear beards rather than face the daily ordeal of shaving. Teeth were a source of problems for almost everyone. Without effective dental care, tooth decay was universal. By middle age, many people had lost numerous teeth. Those remaining might be blackened or broken. Toothaches were common and severe, a throbbing pain that could not be effectively treated. People would try various remedies, applying poultices of herbs, praying to Saint Apollonia, or simply enduring. When a tooth became unbearable, extraction was the only option, a brutal procedure performed without anaesthesia. Breakfast was not always taken, especially during Lent or other fasting periods mandated by the Church. When it was eaten, it was a simple meal, perhaps bread and ale, maybe some cheese or cold meat left from the previous day. The idea of a large hot breakfast is a modern one. Medieval people often began their work on empty stomachs, eating their main meal in the middle of the day. The castle community would gather for morning prayers in the chapel. Attendance was not optional for most. The household would file in according to rank, with the nobles taking the best positions and servants standing in back, or even outside if the chapel was too small to accommodate everyone. The Mass would be in Latin, which most people did not understand. They would stand for long periods, as pews were not common, and they would respond to the liturgy by rote, saying words they had memorized without necessarily understanding their meaning. The chapel itself was the most decorated space in the castle, with painted walls, perhaps stained glass in the windows if the lord was wealthy, and carved stonework. The altar was the focus, covered with fine cloth, and displaying a crucifix, candlesticks, and other holy items. Relics were kept here, in special containers called reliquaries, often made of precious metals and decorated with jewels. The priest who conducted these services held significant power. As the intermediary between the community and God, he could grant or withhold absolution for sins. He could refuse the sacraments to someone he judged unworthy, effectively condemning them to damnation in the eyes of the community. This power could be abused. Some priests demanded payments or favours in exchange for spiritual services. Others took advantage of their position in darker ways. After morning prayers, the work of the castle began in earnest. The division of labour was complex, with dozens or even hundreds of people each having specific roles. The steward managed the castle's accounts and supplies, a position of great responsibility. The chamberlain oversaw the lord's private chambers. The marshal was responsible for the horses and stables. The cook commanded the kitchen staff. Each of these positions had numerous subordinates. In the stables, grooms would be mucking out stalls, removing the soiled straw and horse manure, and replacing it with fresh straw. The smell of horse manure was pervasive in and around stables. The grooms would then feed the horses, brush them, check their hooves for problems. Horses were valuable, essential for transportation and warfare, and their care was taken seriously. The blacksmith's forge would be fired up, the bellows pumping to bring the coals to the intense heat needed to work iron. The blacksmith and his assistants would spend the day making and repairing tools, weapons, horseshoes, and the 1,000 metal items needed for castle life. The work was hot, dangerous, and physically demanding. Sparks flew constantly. Burns were common. The ring of hammer on anvil echoed across the castle yard. In the castle yard itself, various activities took place. Guards drilled with weapons, practicing the skills that might save their lives in battle. The clash of wood on wood or metal on metal rang out as they sparred. Boys training to be knights would practice as well, under the watchful eye of experienced warriors who would criticize and correct their form, sometimes punctuating their instruction with blows. Merchants and tradespeople might be admitted through the gates, bringing goods to sell or services to provide. A tinker might come to repair pots and pans. A travelling merchant might display fabric or spices. Beggars would gather near the gates, hoping for charity. The sick and crippled among them would display their afflictions, seeking to inspire pity and generosity. The castle well was a centre of activity, with people constantly coming to draw water. Water was needed for cooking, cleaning, washing and drinking. The well was also a social space where servants would gather and exchange gossip while waiting their turn. The gossip network in a castle was extensive, as servants knew everything that happened within the walls. They knew who was sleeping with whom, who was in favour or out of favour, who was sick, who was fighting. This information was currency, traded and shared. Laundry was an enormous task that might be undertaken once a month or less frequently. Clothing had to be washed by hand, a process that required heating large quantities of water, making or obtaining soap, scrubbing the garments, rinsing them, and then hanging them to dry. In winter, drying was particularly difficult, and wet clothes might be hung near fires where they steamed and added to the dampness of the interior air. The Great Hall served as the centre of castle life. During the day it was used for various purposes. The lord might hold court here, hearing petitions from his tenants, settling disputes, administering justice. Messengers would arrive with news from other lords or from the king. Travelling minstrels or jongleurs might perform, hoping for payment and a meal. The legal proceedings that took place in the Great Hall could be harsh. A peasant accused of stealing might be brought before the lord. Evidence would be presented, though the standards of evidence were far looser than in modern courts. The accused might have no one to speak for them, no legal representation. The lord's judgment would be final and immediate. A guilty verdict might result in flogging, mutilation, or hanging. Mutilation was used as punishment for various crimes. A thief might have a hand cut off. Someone who spread slander might have their tongue cut out or be branded on the face. These punishments served as both retribution and as a permanent mark that warned others of the person's criminal past. People bearing these mutilations would live out their lives marked, unable to hide what they had done, facing discrimination and difficulty finding work. The castle's dungeon, often located in the lowest level, in a tower or beneath the keep, housed prisoners awaiting trial or execution, or those being held for ransom. Conditions in dungeons were appalling. Some were little more than pits with grated openings at the top, into which prisoners were lowered by rope. Others were small cells with heavy doors. Light was minimal or absent. Fresh air was scarce. The cold was intense. Prisoners might be chained to the walls in positions that made it impossible to sit or lie down comfortably. Food for prisoners was minimal, often just bread and water, and not much of that. The purpose was not to maintain the prisoners' health, but simply to keep them alive until their trial or execution. Many prisoners died in the dungeons from disease, starvation, or simply from the brutal conditions. Their bodies might lie where they died for days before being removed. Torture chambers were sometimes located near the dungeons. Here, various devices were kept for extracting confessions or punishing criminals. The rack, as mentioned earlier, was common. So was the strappado. Other devices included the breaking wheel, where victims would be tied to a large wheel and have their limbs broken with hammers, then left on the wheel to die slowly. The Iron Maiden, a cabinet lined with spikes, was less common than popular imagination suggests, but other forms of piercing and crushing were used. The person who administered torture, the torturer or executioner, was a social pariah despite performing a necessary function for the authorities. Executioners often lived outside the castle or town walls, in designated areas. They were not allowed to interact freely with other people. Their children were marked by their father's profession and faced discrimination. Yet someone had to do the job, and it was passed down through families, creating dynasties of executioners. The midday meal, dinner, was the main meal of the day. Preparation began hours in advance, with fires stoked high and multiple dishes prepared simultaneously. The kitchen during dinner preparation was a scene of controlled chaos. Cooks shouted orders, servants ran back and forth, pots bubbled over fires, meat roasted on spits turned by young boys who had to stand in the heat for hours. Steam and smoke filled the air. The variety of dishes prepared for the lord's table could be impressive in a wealthy castle. Multiple courses might include roasted meats, boiled meats, pies, fish if it was a fast day, various dishes made with eggs, and elaborate confections. Each dish would be prepared separately and arranged on platters. The skill of the cook was demonstrated by the complexity and presentation of the food. Servants would carry the dishes from the kitchen to the great hall in a procession, each dish covered to keep it warm. In larger castles, the distance from kitchen to hall could be considerable, and despite the covers, food often arrived lukewarm. The servers would present each dish to the lord first, who would take what he wanted. Then it would be passed down the table in order of rank. Table manners existed, but were different from ours. People ate with their hands and with knives. They would take meat from a common platter, cut it on their trencher, and eat it with their fingers. Greasy hands were wiped on bread or on the tablecloth. Bones were thrown to the floor for the dogs. Drinking vessels were often shared, passed from person to person. People drank deeply and often, as the food was salty and thirst-provoking. Entertainment during dinner might include music. A small group of musicians might play in a gallery or corner of the hall, providing a pleasant background to the meal. The music would be very different from what we know today, with instruments like the lute, vielle, rebec, and various early wind instruments, producing sounds that would seem strange to modern ears. After dinner, the lord might conduct business or simply relax. Hunting was a favourite pastime for the nobility when weather permitted. Hawks and falcons were prized for hunting birds. Dogs were used for hunting larger game. The hunt was highly ritualised, with specific procedures for tracking game, releasing the dogs at the right moment and making the kill. The actual killing of prey was often brutal and prolonged. A deer brought to bay by the hounds would be exhausted and terrified, facing the snapping jaws of the dogs and the weapons of the hunters. The moment of the kill might involve multiple spear thrusts or arrow shots. The prey would bleed, cry out and struggle until finally death came. This was not seen as cruel, but as sport, as the natural order of things. After a successful hunt, the kill would be butchered in the field. The process was complex, with different parts of the animal given to different participants according to their rank. The hounds would be rewarded with portions of the animal, fed on the still warm flesh to encourage their hunting instinct. The butchered meat would be carried back to the castle, where it would be prepared for future meals. Women of the castle, when not involved in managing household affairs, spent much of their time on needlework. Embroidery, weaving, and spinning were constant occupations. The finest embroidery was prized, used to decorate clothing, altar cloths, and wall hangings. Creating these elaborate pieces required hundreds of hours of close work in poor light, straining the eyes and causing back and neck pain from hunching over the work. Childbearing and child-rearing consumed much of a noblewoman's adult life. Women married young, often in their early teens, and were expected to produce heirs. Pregnancy was dangerous and frequent. Without effective contraception, a sexually active woman might be pregnant every year or two throughout her fertile years. Each pregnancy carried significant risk. The process of childbirth itself was attended only by women. Men, including physicians, were not usually present. Midwives and female relatives would assist. The labouring woman would sit or squat on a birthing stool, a chair with a hole in the seat. Labour could last for days. The pain was intense, and there was nothing to alleviate it beyond perhaps some wine or herbal preparations of dubious effectiveness. If labour went wrong, the options were limited and terrible. If the baby was stuck, the midwife might try to turn it, a process that was agonising and often unsuccessful. If the baby died in the womb, it had to be extracted somehow. Instruments existed for this purpose, hooks and other tools that would be used to dismember the dead baby and remove it piece by piece. The mother might survive this, but infection almost always followed, and she would die days or weeks later in fever and agony. Even when birth went well, the dangers were not over. Hemorrhaging could kill a new mother quickly. Infection of the womb, called childbed fever, killed thousands of women. The symptoms would begin a few days after birth. Fever, pain in the abdomen, foul-smelling discharge. The infection would spread through the body, causing delirium and eventual death. No one understood that this was caused by bacterial infection, often introduced by the unwashed hands of those attending the birth. Infants who survived birth faced their own perils. Many died within the first few days or weeks from various causes. Some had birth defects that were incompatible with life. Others simply failed to thrive, weakening and dying despite their mother's best efforts. Diseases like whooping cough, measles, and various fevers killed infants and young children in large numbers. Mothers were advised not to become too attached to their babies in the early months, given how likely death was. The emotional impact of losing child after child was devastating, but women had no choice but to endure it. Some women lost half or more of their children. The grief was real and deep, but it had to be borne, and often another pregnancy would follow soon after a loss. Wet nurses were employed by wealthy families. A woman who had recently given birth and had milk would be hired to nurse the noble baby. This was considered healthier than having the mother nurse, and it also freed the mother to become pregnant again more quickly, as breastfeeding tends to delay the return of fertility. The wet nurse's own baby might be weaned early or given to another to nurse, a cascading effect that could be deadly for lower-class infants. Children who survived infancy faced numerous health challenges. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, was common, resulting in bowed legs and other skeletal deformities. Various intestinal parasites were nearly universal. Worms would be purged periodically with herbal treatments, but reinfection was rapid. Skin conditions like scabies and ringworm spread easily among people living in close quarters. The education of noble children began young. Boys destined for knighthood would be sent away from home at around age 7 to serve as pages in another household. This was considered essential for their training, but it meant separation from parents at a tender age. The boy would serve at table, run errands, and begin learning the skills needed for knighthood. The training was strict and the boys were often homesick and frightened, but showing emotion was discouraged. As pages grew older, they would become squires, personal servants to knights. They would care for the knight's armour and weapons, help him dress for battle, and accompany him in combat. This was dangerous. Squires might be caught up in fighting, and many were injured or killed before ever achieving knighthood themselves. The squire would also continue to train in weapons and horsemanship, building the skills needed to become a knight. Knighthood was achieved through a ceremony called dubbing, usually in the late teenage years or early 20s. The night before, the candidate would keep vigil in the chapel, praying and meditating on the responsibilities of knighthood. In the morning, he would be ceremonially bathed and dressed in new clothes. The dubbing itself involved the lord striking the candidate's shoulder with the flat of a sword and pronouncing him a knight. A feast would follow, celebrating the new knight's entry into the warrior class. But knighthood brought expectations. The knight was expected to serve his lord in war, to maintain expensive equipment and horses, to host other knights and display hospitality. For younger sons with no inheritance, meeting these expectations could be difficult. Some became landless knights, essentially warriors for hire, moving from place to place seeking employment. Others married into wealth if they could, or descended into poverty. Girls of noble birth received different education. They learned household management, spinning, weaving, and embroidery. Some were taught to read, particularly in households that valued learning, but many remained illiterate. Their education focused on preparing them to manage a household and to be suitable wives. They too were often sent to other households to learn, serving as companions to the lady of the castle, and learning by observation and practice. Marriage for noble girls was arranged by their families for political or economic advantage. The girl herself had little say. She might meet her betrothed only briefly before the wedding, or in some cases not at all. She would be told whom she would marry and she would obey. Refusal was not really an option, as it would bring shame on her family and leave her with few prospects. The wedding itself was a public affair, a ceremony that legally bound two families together. The bride and groom would exchange vows in the church with witnesses present. The marriage had to be consummated to be valid, and in some cases witnesses would be present outside the bridal chamber, or even in it to confirm that consummation had occurred. This was humiliating and traumatic, particularly for a young bride. The pressure on a new bride to produce children, particularly male heirs, was intense. If she failed to become pregnant quickly, she might be suspected of being barren, a shame that could lead to the marriage being annulled, or to her being set aside. If she produced only daughters, she would be blamed, though we now know that the sex of a child is determined by the father's contribution. The lack of a male heir could threaten the entire succession of a lordship. Women who did not marry, either by choice or circumstance, had limited options. They might remain in their father's household, essentially unpaid servants to their family, or they might enter a convent taking religious vows. Convents offered a life removed from the dangers of childbirth and from male domination, but they also required obedience to the rule of the order, and to the abbess who governed the convent. Life in a convent was highly structured. The nuns rose for prayers multiple times during the night and day, following a schedule called the Divine Office. They spent hours in prayer and contemplation. They also worked, growing food, making items to sell, and caring for the sick in some orders. The discipline was strict. Silence was often required, and the life was one of denial and sacrifice. But convents could also be places of learning and relative freedom. Some nuns became scholars, copying manuscripts and even writing original works. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, wrote theological works, composed music, and described visions she experienced. She corresponded with popes and emperors, wielding influence that would have been impossible for a laywoman. Monasteries, the male equivalent, similarly combined prayer, work, and learning. Monks followed the rule of St. Benedict or similar guidelines, balancing prayer, study, and labour. Monasteries often had the best libraries, the scriptoria where books were copied, and sometimes schools. They preserved much of the learning from classical antiquity, copying works by ancient authors that might otherwise have been lost. But monasteries were also part of the feudal system. They owned land, controlled peasants, and participated in the economy. Some monasteries became wealthy and corrupt, with abbots living in luxury while the monks did the work. Reformers periodically arose, calling for a return to simpler, more ascetic practice. But the tendency toward worldliness reasserted itself over time. The afternoon in the castle would pass with continued work. Servants would clean, prepare the evening meal, tend animals, make repairs. The castle required constant maintenance. Stone might need repointing where mortar had crumbled. Roofs needed patching, wells needed cleaning, cisterns needed attention. There was always something that needed doing. Training exercises might continue for the garrison. Archers would practice at targets, loosing arrow after arrow to maintain their skill. Crossbowmen would do the same. The sound of arrows hitting targets, the twang of bowstrings, the shouts of instructors, these were familiar sounds in a castle courtyard. The armoury was a crucial space, where weapons and armour were stored and maintained. Rust was a constant enemy. Weapons had to be cleaned, oiled, and sharpened regularly. Armour had to be checked for damage, leather straps replaced, dents hammered out. The armourer and his assistants spent their days on this never-ending work. Chainmail, worn by many soldiers, was particularly labour-intensive to maintain. Each suit of mail consisted of thousands of interlocking metal rings. If rings broke, they had to be replaced, a fiddly task requiring patience and good eyesight. The mail also had to be cleaned to prevent rust. One method involved putting the mail in a barrel with sand and vinegar and rolling it, an abrasive process that cleaned the metal. Swords were prized possessions for those wealthy enough to own them. A good sword represented months or years of a craftsman's work. The blade had to be hard enough to hold an edge, but flexible enough not to shatter on impact. Achieving this balance required skill in forging and tempering. A knight's sword might be one of his most valuable possessions, given a name and treasured throughout his life. Other weapons were more common. Spears were the primary weapon for many soldiers, cheap to make and effective. Axes and maces required less skill to use than swords and could be devastatingly effective. The mace, a heavy metal head on a shaft, could crush bone through armour. A blow from a mace to the head could kill instantly or leave the victim brain damaged and crippled. Arrows and crossbow bolts were produced in large quantities. Fletchers would attach feathers to arrow shafts, ensuring they flew straight. Different types of arrowheads were used for different purposes. Bodkin points were narrow and designed to pierce armour. Broadheads were wider, designed to cause massive bleeding in unarmoured targets. Crossbow bolts were shorter and thicker, designed to withstand the immense force of the crossbow's release. The crossbow was a controversial weapon. It could penetrate armour at impressive distances, and it required less training to use effectively than a longbow. This meant that a common soldier with minimal training could kill a knight who had trained for years and wore expensive armour. The church even banned its use against Christians at one point, though this was widely ignored. The crossbow was seen as ungentlemanly, a weapon that upset the social order. The longbow, particularly the English longbow, required years of training to use effectively. Archers began training in childhood, developing the massive upper body strength needed to draw the heavy bows. Analysis of skeletons of medieval archers shows deformation of the bones from the repeated stress of drawing the bow. But a skilled longbowman could loose arrows rapidly and accurately, and massed longbowmen could decimate attacking forces. As evening approached, the castle would begin to settle into its nighttime routine. The evening meal, supper, was lighter than dinner. It might consist of leftovers from dinner, along with bread, cheese, and ale. The household would gather again in the great hall, though this meal was less formal and often quicker than dinner. After supper, entertainment might be offered. A minstrel might sing songs, accompanying himself on a lute or harp. The songs would tell of great deeds, tragic romances, or comic tales. Some songs were hundreds of verses long, epic poems that took hours to perform. The audience would listen attentively, as this was one of the primary forms of entertainment available. Storytelling was another entertainment. Professional storytellers, or simply members of the household who had a gift for narrative, would tell tales. Some stories were historical or pseudo-historical, tales of great heroes like Charlemagne or King Arthur. Others were religious, stories of saints and their miracles. Still others were bawdy or comic, designed to provoke laughter. Games were played in the evening. Chess had been introduced from the Islamic world and was popular among the nobility. The pieces and rules were similar to the modern game, though there were some variations. Backgammon and various dice games were also common. Card games began to appear late in the medieval period, though they were initially expensive as each card had to be hand-painted. Children had their own games and toys. Wooden dolls, carved animals, balls made from leather or inflated pig bladders, hoops to roll with sticks. Children played games of chase, hide and seek, and made up imaginative play. But their play was often interrupted by work duties, as children were expected to contribute to the household from a young age. As full darkness fell, the castle became a more dangerous place. Those who needed to move through the passages would carry candles or small oil lamps, but these provided only limited light. The castle became a place of deep shadows where it was easy to become disoriented. The wise stayed in their assigned areas, going abroad only when necessary. The guards who patrolled the walls and towers at night faced a lonely, cold duty. They would walk their assigned routes, looking out into the darkness for any signs of threat. In winter, this duty was particularly harsh. The wind on the exposed walls could be brutal, and there was no way to warm up during your watch. Guards might move constantly to generate heat, or huddle in what limited shelter was available. The danger of attack at night was real. Enemies might attempt to scale the walls under cover of darkness, or try to gain entry through treachery, bribing a guard or having a spy inside open a gate. The guards had to remain alert despite the cold, despite fatigue, despite the hours of seeing nothing but darkness. Falling asleep on watch was a serious offence, punishable by flogging or worse. Inside the castle, most people would be in bed by what we would consider early evening, perhaps 8 or 9 o'clock. Without electric light, there was little point in staying up. Candles and lamp oil were too precious to waste. People would retire to their sleeping spaces, remove their outer clothing, and burrow under whatever blankets and furs were available. The sounds of the night in a castle were a constant presence. The wind whistling through gaps, the creak of wood settling, the scurry of rats in the walls, distant sounds of the guards calling to each other, perhaps the cry of a baby or the moan of someone in pain. These sounds formed a backdrop to sleep, familiar and almost comforting in their constancy. Dreams in the medieval period were taken very seriously. They were thought to be messages from God, from saints, or from demons. People would try to interpret their dreams as looking for meaning and guidance. Prophetic dreams were particularly valued, dreams that seemed to foretell future events. Some dreams were considered so significant that they were recorded and shared widely. Nightmares were attributed to demons sitting on the sleeper's chest, suffocating them and creating terrible visions. The very word nightmare comes from this belief, with mare being an old term for a demon or evil spirit. People who woke from nightmares might pray immediately, making the sign of the cross to ward off evil influence. Sleep itself was often interrupted. People would wake in the night, lie awake for a time, then sleep again. This pattern of segmented sleep was normal. The period of wakefulness between sleeps was used productively, for prayer, for thinking, for talking quietly with a bed partner, or for intimacy. The intimacy of married couples was complicated by the lack of privacy. Even noble couples might have servants sleeping in their chamber. The act of procreation was to be undertaken seriously, for the purpose of creating children, not for pleasure. The Church taught that sex for pleasure, even within marriage, was sinful. There were even rules about when sex was forbidden. Fast days, feast days, Sundays, during pregnancy, during menstruation, during penance. If all these prohibitions were followed, there were fewer than 100 days a year when marital sex was permitted. In practice, of course, these rules were often ignored. Human nature and desire did not conform to church teachings, but the teaching created guilt and shame around sexuality, adding a burden to what should be a source of joy and connection. Women in particular were taught that their sexuality was dangerous, a temptation to men, and that they should be modest and restrained. Prostitutes, as mentioned, were available in most towns, and armies were followed by camp followers. The church condemned prostitution, while tacitly acknowledging it as a necessary evil. Prostitutes were marked out by required clothing, sometimes forced to wear specific colours or badges that identified their profession. They were considered sinful and shameful, but they were tolerated because the alternative, it was thought, would be worse sins. Homosexual activity was absolutely forbidden and harshly punished if discovered. Those convicted of sodomy could be executed, often by burning. The fear of accusation kept homosexual individuals deeply hidden. They might marry to maintain appearances, living lives of quiet desperation. Some found ways to conduct secret relationships, but the risk was always present. The church taught that such desires were sinful temptations from the devil, to be resisted at all costs. As the night deepened into the early morning hours, the castle was at its quietest. The guards on the walls were perhaps at their least alert, fighting against exhaustion. Inside, the household slept, their breathing and snoring mixing with the ambient sounds. This was the darkest time, the time when the night seemed endless, when cold and discomfort were most acute. But eventually, imperceptibly, the darkness would begin to thin. The first hints of dawn would appear, not visible inside the castle, but sensed somehow. The roosters would crow. The guards would feel relief that their watch was nearly over. And soon the castle would stir again, beginning another day of labour, struggle, and survival. This cycle repeated endlessly, day after day, season after season, year after year. Each day was similar to the last with minor variations. The seasons brought changes, summer heat and winter cold, harvest time and planting time, but the basic rhythm remained constant. Lives passed within these stone walls, entire lifetimes from birth to death without ever going more than a few miles from the castle. The isolation was profound. News from the wider world arrived slowly and unreliably. A messenger might bring word of events weeks or months after they occurred. Letters were rare, as most people could not write, and sending correspondence required finding someone trustworthy to carry it. The world beyond the immediate region was distant and vague, known only through rumour and the occasional traveller's tale. The sense of time itself was different. Without clocks and with only the most basic calendars, people marked time by events rather than by precise dates. They would remember that something happened the year of the Great Storm, or the year the Lord's Son was born. The concept of being precisely on time for an appointment did not exist as we know it. Time was fluid, marked by the sun's position, the ringing of church bells, the progress of the seasons. History was understood through stories and legends rather than documented facts. The past blended with myth. King Arthur was considered as historical as any recent king. The distinction between legend and history was blurred. Ancient Rome was known, but the understanding was limited and mixed with fantasy. Troy and Carthage were real places in the medieval mind, but their actual history was lost in layers of storytelling.